Hello and welcome to Stand Up Historian. My name is Kurosh, and tonight I have the privilege of having my good friend, technologist and historian Alexei Paladin here with me. And we are going to discuss the Alaska purchase. Alexei, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Kurosh, and thank you for having me back. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming here, sharing your knowledge and your great style of storytelling to tell us about the history of the United States and also in connection with Russia.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So we are going to talk about Alaska purchase.
Yes.
A fantastic deal, right?
Yes.
a great deal. Just to put it in perspective, I prepared some numbers. In terms of landmass, Alaska is bigger than Germany, France, Spain, and United Kingdom combined. And also, it is bigger than Iran, the country of Iran, and almost the same size as Saudi Arabia. A lot of natural resources and an amazing land to be added to the United States and make it this mega massive land that has become the United States of America. Well, take us through the history and tell us what happened and how we ended up having Alaska.
Thank you, and gladly. And to all of our viewers, there are actually three parts of the story. The beginning and middle and the end. The end was in March of 1867, a very dramatic end, where the Russian ambassador, Eduard de Stoeckl, known as the Baron, at 10 p.m., he knocks on the door of the house where the Secretary of State, William Seward, is playing cards with his son. It's 10 p.m. They're relaxing as a family.
Sure.
Stoeckl lived nearby. The Secretary of State opens the door, sees the ambassador, greets him, and the ambassador says, "We are ready to sell." To which the Secretary of State says, "If you can muster your legation before midnight, you will find the Secretary of State, the Department of State open and ready for business."
Wow.
The Stoeckl shows up. William Seward brings his son, but also brings Senator Sumner. And that's important because the senator was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate. And by 4 a.m. on March 30th of 1867, Alaska was sold.
Wow.
But let's go back to the original story.
But before you continue,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
I was thinking 1867, this is what, 71 years after 1776? Declaration of Independence, and then you have a nation that already acquiring new land,
Yes.
new territories.
Oh, yes.
This is impressive. Even before that, there was Louisiana Purchase.
Of course. And actually, as an outcome of our story, we will learn how Seward was called for the purchase of Alaska. People said it was Seward's Folly.
Yes.
And he purchased an ice box, and there are only polar bears and walruses, and why would we do that? And he was comforted by the fact that the same was said about President Jefferson when he purchased Louisiana. Because back in the day it was said, oh, he bought a bunch of swamp. And who needs that? Of course, right?
Of course.
And it turned out in a different way.
Yeah.
But to the origin story
Yes.
of how the Russians even came to Alaska and why. Actually, the territory that was known as Russian America was known that way for more than 125 years. During that span, the Russian Empire was in Europe, it was in Asia, and it was on the North American continent, believe it or not. More than 100 years. And it all began with Peter the Great in 1725, sending Vitus Bering to see if the landmass of Asia connects to America. On his second expedition, Bering and Captain Sven Waxel. And Captain Waxel was the one who established first contact in 1741. First contact with the Native Americans.
1741.
With the Aleuts.
Yes.
And that is important because as they were progressing, as they went through Siberia and Kamchatka and up north and made the contact, they found, of course, different nations and different tribes. Some of them were friendly, some were not. They had to fight their way. But as Captain Waxel reported the Aleuts were very friendly. They actually invited them to come ashore and spend some time together. They talked. And what Captain Waxel observed began the whole business of exploring Alaska. He saw that they were hunters. He saw that they had boats, the so-called baidar, the lever-covered boats that were very agile in the water, but also very lightweight. Aleut could lift it with one arm and place it in the water and then go hunting for what?
Yeah.
Sea otters.
Oh, okay. Sea otters.
The Russians had moved from Europe through Siberia to Kamchatka chasing fur,
Yes.
the soft gold. The Spaniards were conquering America in search of the real gold. The Russians were going after the soft gold. And the sea otter had been something that they had never encountered. They dealt with beaver and fox and all kinds of animals. When they brought back a sample of the sea otter, it blew everybody's mind, literally, because the density of the fur per square inch is more than 1 million hairs. Nobody had seen fur of that quality. And I actually did a little bit of a calculation for our viewers to establish the value of a sea otter. A couple of episodes ago, we talked about the value of fox pelts, if you recall.
Yes.
For one sea otter pelt, one could buy 50 houses, 2,000 acres of land, 250 horses, 500 cows, and 1,000 sheep for one pelt.
One pelt.
That blew everybody's mind in St. Petersburg when news got back, and that's how the exploration of Alaska started. Private parties, entrepreneurs, who were going after the treasure, the promise that was out there. What began organically was followed up with the Russian government sending proper expeditions, and ultimately the different pioneers started forming companies. And one of those companies was formed by Grigory Shelikhov and his wonderful wife, Natalia Shelikhova, who ultimately gave him 11 sons and daughters.
Wow.
A wonderful mom who not only ran the business, but she actually went on expeditions. Again, crossing Siberia, crossing Kamchatka, going into the wilderness, where they landed on a number of points in Alaska and established the first colonies. When they came back to Russia, they actually pursued the court. They went to see Catherine the Great. And their proposal was that the Russian government grant them a monopoly, an opportunity to establish a joint stock company, which was also new in Europe at the time, a proper capitalist business, but a monopoly. Catherine the Great was not in favor of that, but her son, Paul I, when he assumed the throne, in 1799, granted a monopoly to the Russian-American Company, which would soon become one of the most profitable businesses, not only in Russia, but in all of Europe.
Comparable to East India Company of England?
Not only comparable, but modeled on.
Oh, okay.
In many ways, the Russians had studied that success, and they were recreating their own and building that business, but now not based on what the East India Company was doing, tea and such, but based on the fur and the soft gold. And there was so much of it that in 1 year, since 1799 to 1800, the stock price rose more than 300%. In 3 years' time, they were paying out dividends to their shareholders, which included the royal family, by the way.
Of course.
The amount of dividends in 1803 amounted to the equivalent of 50,000 cottages.
50,000?
50,000 cottages that people could buy.
Based on the numbers that you gave us, that makes sense. Yes.
What was being formed was a new form of business, but it also came with stipulations. It was interesting that the government of Paul I, they had heard the stories of what was happening in the wilderness. They wanted this to be organized experiment. And believe it or not, they stipulated social services. They said, you are rich, you are able to provide basic education to the families, you're able to provide health care, you will also provide pensions to those who serve the company well and retire because of either age or because they're hurt in all of the explorations. And the company did so, and the company evolved. Which brings us to the conclusion of the first period between 1741 and about 1820. That was the period, as described by historians, when there was a lot of fur, but not a lot of customers. Reason being was that the Russians were good at getting fur, they were not very good at actually shipping it to multiple locations around the world. And at that point in time, the Americans actually come into the picture. Americans such as the Astor Company, the fur company that established the city of Astoria in the Oregon Territory. The Americans were good with their ships and moving the product, and they were also bringing a vital resource to Alaska. Where fur was plentiful, they didn't have enough food. They had to resupply somehow in some way, which led actually the Russian-American company to continue to explore not only from Alaska as a base, but go down south. And in 1812, established the colony of Fort Ross. Yes. And in 1815, 1817, go to Hawaii. And the flag of the Russian-American company actually flew over the island of Kauai because the king of Kauai, he signed a treaty with the Russian Empire. So suddenly Russia found itself based in Alaska, portions of California, and even in Hawaii. Yes, it was an interesting period of time. And between 1820 and 1840, it was a period of dynamic growth and generation of wealth. And for a good portion of that time, Natalia Shelikhova, who became a widow in 1795, she not only was raising the children, multiple children, she was running the whole company and hiring the best people that she possibly could.
Amazing story. So between 1740 until 1867, when the purchase happened, this was territory of Russia and the business. And then I remember we talked about merchant fleets that the United States had, and it was always the envy of the Russia that, hey, I don't have a fleet, you have. And that cooperation helped to create a lot of wealth for both countries and companies involved.
Very, very much so. Yeah. And the Russians understood what they didn't have, and they were open to creating proper joint ventures, which was also a novel idea.
Of course.
But based on the friendship that the two countries enjoyed continuously without any conflict, the joint ventures were actually very productive. So what the Americans did was bring the food, but then transfer the fur to different markets, either to the east coast of the United States or, more importantly, to China. China was a tremendous consumer of the fancy furs. It was a very hot market for both countries. And at that point in time, the Russian-American company had a wonderful person running the whole operation in Alaska. In essence, for about 30 years, Mr. Baranov was the governor. He was it.
Governor of Alaska.
Governor of Alaska and that whole territory.
And where did the name come from?
Baranov?
No, Alaska.
Alaska was actually a local name.
Local name. Okay.
Some of the locals, the native Alaskans, actually called certain portions that way, and the Russians repeated that. So it wasn't invented by the Russians.
Ended up being the name of the state eventually.
Yes.
Very interesting. So walk us through the history and bring us to the point of the deal.
Mm-hmm. So by about 1820, 1825, the peak of the growth, and a few things happen. The company becomes very powerful and also starts to meddle with affairs. And that plays into things because Alaska was sold for a number of reasons. Geopolitical and strategic, we're going to get to that. A little bit economic, we're going to get to the fact that Alaska was almost given for free to the United States with no payment at all. But it was also some personal stuff, as they say, that was going on between the Tsars and the management of the Russian-American company. In 1825, in December of 1825, there was an attempt at a revolution.
Yes.
And the revolutionaries were actually based at the headquarters of the RAC, Russian-American Company, in St. Petersburg. Downtown, they had a wonderful building to themselves, luxurious apartments. And on the one hand, they had studied how the United States had evolved in the form of government, and they were proponents of repeating a process of establishing a Congress, electing a president and whatnot. But at the same time, they were quite brutal in their approach. They wanted to exile Tsar Alexander I to Fort Ross to California, kidnap and exile so that he never would come back. Alexander I, passed away, or as Leo Tolstoy believed, disappeared. So Nicholas I, his brother, wound up dealing with that whole uprising in December of 1825. And when the dust settled, as they say, when the conspirators were imprisoned and some of them were executed, before the finale, Nicholas I was actually presented with a list of the personas that were going to change Russia by killing him. That was actually one of the things that they wanted to achieve on that day. Kill the Tsar was one of their goals. And when he looked at the long list and he saw the names of the prominent managers of the rack,
yes.
He looked at the chief prosecutor and said, "What a wonderful company you've gathered there." In total disbelief. A lot of them were exiled, and that actually had an impact, a psychological impact that lasted with Nicholas I, who looked at the company through a certain prism and a certain disdain, and it transferred over to Alexander II, who succeeded him. So by 1840, from a peak of company performance, things started slowing down. From 1840 onwards, as a Russian historian said, the cash box was empty. The fur was exploited to the max. It went further into the inland territories, which are more difficult to reach for a variety of reasons. And then certain things started happening geopolitically. And around 1843, the U.S. Secretary of State, William Marcy, actually, with Senator Gwynn, and both were expansionists. And of course, context of what's going on in America. Go west, expand from the Louisiana territories, Texas, California, utter expansion. In 1843, both of them actually approached the government of Nicholas I and said, "Would you sell?" The response astounded them. And what was recorded in 1843 and then 1845 by the Secretary of Treasury, Robert Walker, was that the government of Nicholas I said, "We'll give it to you on one condition, From the Oregon territories, modern-day state of Washington in the United States, capture the coastline of British Columbia and connect to what is today the modern state of Alaska. Squeeze the British out of the access to the Pacific." It's interesting that at that point in time, there were discussions in U.S. Congress of a potential annexation of Canada, of the whole of Canada. For a variety of reasons that didn't happen. And for a variety of reasons, the U.S. government said, we don't have the capability to mount a war against the British and take that coastline. To which Nicholas said, too bad, we'll just leave that question for now. What happened then was the second war that the British waged against Russia. Of course, we know that the British had the Revolutionary War against the United States, and then the War of 1812 and 1814. What few maybe know, or perhaps it's forgotten, that Britain waged a war between 1807 and 1812. It was called the Anglo-Russian War. And then, of course, there was the Crimean War. And what terrified the Tsars was that it was not just happening in the European part, but the British and their allies, the French, they attacked Kamchatka. Petropolis-Kamchatsky, the main base of operation that supported Alaska up north, was attacked. And there was uncertainty on whether the Russians would prevail. So at that point in time, the Russian government contacted the administration of President Pierce and said, "You want Alaska? You can take it." For reasons unknown, and perhaps one of these days we can find more information for the National Archives, the Department of State and such, but was recorded by a historian back in 1908 that for reasons that were kept from the public, as it was stated, the Pierce administration did not accept the offer to take Alaska for free. Which brings us to 1859. President Buchanan authorizes Senator Gwynne to contact the Russian ambassador and start negotiations in earnest. The US is doing well, the economy is going well. Can we buy Alaska? The Russian government responds saying, let's have a negotiation. And it was actually Senator Gwynne that presented the first offer of $5 million. We're going to get to the actual payment in a second.
This was an offer from the United States.
The United States, yes. That was actually done by Senator Gwynne on behalf of the U.S. to Ambassador de Stoeckl. But things change. Things change for the United States, obviously, in 1860, 1861, the Civil War, other things going on. Alaska is on the back burner.
Yeah.
Until, of course, the war is over, and things change in Russia as well. Russia was looking at the whole situation holistically and strategically. And on the one hand, Russia did need money, as has been portrayed by many historians, that the Russians just needed money badly, but it wasn't that bad. Because on the one hand, Russia did deal with the consequences of the Crimean War and the economy there. The Tsar actually owed money to the Rothschilds. He borrowed from them to finance the emancipation of the serfs. He had to pay the landowners to keep them happy, that they would release, in essence, the slaves and finance that whole thing. And he was paying 5% interest to the Rothschilds, and he wanted to deal with that.
Okay.
Only 5%. But so he wanted to deal with that. But in all honesty, money wasn't the main reason. Ultimately, Russia was paid, as is known, as established, $7.2 million. Ambassador de Stoeckl negotiated from the $5 million that was originally presented in 1859, a little bit upwards of that. But if you look at where the money actually went, interesting side story, but 2/3 actually went to Americans. If we go back to the history of the Russian Railroad, George Washington Whistler, when he came over to build the Moscow-St. Petersburg Railroad, he brought with him two very industrious brothers, the Winans brothers. Whistler died, his family moved away. The Winanses continued that business for the 1850s, 1860s and such, and they were getting themselves into hot water with the Russian government. They were being accused of bribing local officials and all kinds of deals. So Alexander II actually wanted to get rid of them. So believe it or not, if we trace the payment that came from the US government, the $7.2 million, 60% of that actually went to the Winans brothers to just buy out their shares and say, leave Russia, leave us alone.
90% of the payment.
60% of
60%.
60, but still.
60%. I thought 6 million. Okay. 60%.
60% of the payment went to them. And of course, that brings us to the payment itself and the fact that if you look at any history book, it will tell you that the 580,000 acres of land, 580,000 square miles. Of the territory, were sold at 2 cents per acre.
Yes.
Again, it was more of a symbolic payment.
Yeah.
Because Alexander II, in a continuation of policy that continued from his father, Nicholas I, had also made overtures to the Americans with the same idea. Can you just take the coastline of British Columbia, connect the United States proper to your new territory of Alaska, and if you can do that, you can have it for free. One thing that is also interesting that comes up in history books is that, those Russians, they didn't know that they were sitting on the riches. They didn't know that they had gold. They didn't know that they had all these natural resources under their feet. That is actually not true. For the 100th anniversary of the sale of Alaska in 1967, there was a wonderful historical account produced by the University of Washington Press. And Professor Mazur of the Stanford University, he did a deep dive into what the Russians knew or did not know about the riches of Alaska beyond the fur. Forget about the fur. They knew very well. They had a surveyor come through the territory in 1848 that found gold. that found other precious metals, that there were indicators of other riches under their feet. What the Russians understood was that they didn't have the resources to
To
actually,
keep and protect that territory.
yes, to not only get to what was under their feet, because
Exactly.
that is very expensive, all the mining and the shipping
Yes.
and the specialty, but also to protect the territory.
Yeah.
Because, of course, there had been a gold rush where in California
Yes.
and also in British Columbia and the Yukon territories and
Yes.
such. So the Russians, when they weighed the considerations, they said, A, let's have the Americans purchase it and not the British. That was a determination.
Very smart move.
And then let's get at least a symbolic payment for this thing, as opposed to nothing at all, because they were concerned that a force would show up, first men with shovels going after the gold,
Yes.
followed by soldiers and bayonets that could take that territory. So a set of things. On the one hand, starting off with the disdain that the emperors already had to the Russian American company because of certain things, going to economic considerations, and then the geopolitical and strategic decision. It has to be American because America has been an ally
Yes.
against Britain continuously.
So, what was the consequences of that purchase for the United States and the sales for the Russians? Did Russia achieve her goals in stopping the British, or gain some geopolitical advantages as the results of that sale?
The geopolitical advantage was basically focused on the continued alliance. And that was felt by both sides because when the deal actually happened, it was consummated, as we mentioned, on March 30th of 1867. And it was done basically in about 4 days. One of the reasons was that Seward understood that Congress was itching to go on recess, and he only had a small window of time. That's why the drama of meet by midnight, do the deal by
Yes.
4 a.m., and
Yes.
so on and so forth. And it was actually Senator Sumner, as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that pushed it through the Senate. But the votes, interestingly enough, were 37 to 2, 37 for the deal and only 2 against. And the only member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that was disapproving and stated that disapproval, he said, I would only agree if Seward himself is forced to live in Alaska. then I'll sign this deal. But what I did want to mention in answering your question was the statement that the head of the Foreign Relations Committee made during the acquisition. He said, quote, a new expression of that entente cordiale, or that union that is very cordial between the two powers, which is a phenomenon of history. So it was basically a continuation of relations, and the Russians communicated that to the Americans. This is a goodwill deal. And America saw it that same way.
And America understood that gesture, that Russia was doing this as a goodwill.
Very much so.
Yes.
Very much so. The American press, if you read the contemporary papers, they reflected upon that. And initially, it was only later that it became known as Seward's Folly. But initially, the press was actually very supportive of the deal because Seward himself, he was very consistent. Even before he became Secretary of State back to the 1850s, he was talking about the geopolitical reason for having Alaska as basically a base for America to expand and to build new trade routes to Asia, to go from there to China and other parts of the world. So he was very consistent.
So this was perhaps the sweetest deal was ever made. And we all know Alaska ended up being a great source of oil, minerals, and most importantly, I have traveled, I have been on that Yukon road and Alaska, tried to go to as remote as possible. And the more you spend time there, the more you fall in love with that beautiful, amazing territory.
Absolutely. And actually, the Russians who left, they left memoirs. They were sad. They were sad to leave.
And they had to leave?
They had to leave. It wasn't that the Americans were forcing them out. The changing of the guard happened in what was known as Novoarkhangelsk, modern day Sitka, about a year after the deal was done. Um, some Russians stayed. A lot of the Creoles stayed. A lot of the Aleuts stayed behind. And when you visit modern day Sitka, you can still see the Russian churches there and other reflections of the culture and what had happened. The reason why the Russians were sad was, of course, the beauty of the territory, but also the personal connections that they developed. And this goes back to the time of Governor Baranov, to whom there is a wonderful statue in Sitka with some very kind words from modern day Americans, because he was a kind man. Again, there were incidents between the Russians as the settlers and the colonists and the native population. There was a war that Baranov was forced to fight in between 1804 and 1807. It was called the Tlingit War, because as he went from Kodiak Island to Sitka Island, he originally thought he made a deal with the Tlingit chiefs to purchase certain land and pay them. It was found very soon that the Tlingit behaved in a certain manner. The Russians, after they established their first fort, they invited the Tlingit over for a festival, a joint dinner. Sentries were amazed when they saw the men walking in with weapons that were concealed on their bodies, and they stopped them, and that was the first sign. A couple of years later, Baranov was with his main force on Kodiak Island, and the Tlingit came in to Fort St. Michael. They killed all the men. They enslaved all the women and all the children, which were also plentiful, hundreds that were living there, and demanded that a bribe be paid for every single head and ransom, and Baranov had to fight a war with them. Ultimately, it all ended well, both with the Aleut population and also the Tlingit. Before Baranov left, after serving for 30 years as the head of basically all of Alaska, he was about 70 years old at the time, and he thought, it's enough, I'm going to go home. There were wonderful portraits created by a Russian artist, and perhaps we could display them for our viewers. A portrait of Baranov, and also a portrait of the Tlingit chief at the time, who is actually seen wearing a medal. And the medal says, ally to Russia. And medals like that were given to multiple tribes, not only in Alaska, but also in California. It is an interesting also part of history that the only known treaty that was ever concluded in modern day state of California between the descendants of European nations and the local native population was actually done by the Russians at Fort Ross with the Kashipomo tribe. And it was a proper treaty, and the Kashipomo were always treated very well. Again, because Baranov said so. He actually explicitly wrote orders saying, all of the natives shall not be forced to do anything. You shall not use your superior weapons or fighting skills. You'll find a way to coexist, to employ, to bring them into the fold. So when Russians left California, when they left Alaska, they were leaving behind a part of themselves because they had integrated. Baranov himself, he actually married a local woman. He had 3 Creole children.
Wow.
And it was,
So, question came to my mind. At any point in time after the sale of Alaska during the Soviet era, was there any attempt that they say, you know what, we want Alaska back or anything? A regret, expressed regret or anything like that?
Oh, of course. Even to today, a lot of Russians express that regret, not knowing the backstory and the whole big picture of the relations.
At the time.
It goes back to, the Tsars, dummies, 2 cents an acre, and without understanding the full reason why. As in the Soviet days, of course, there was a standoff militarily, especially during the Cold War. I was a Cold War soldier on the Soviet
Yes.
side of things. I was actually based in the far eastern military district. And one of my jobs, thankfully, times were changing when I was there between 1988 and 1990.
Sure.
But the original job was prepare for an invading force coming from Alaska across the Bering Strait into Chukotka, into Kamchatka, and such. And yeah,
So
times
they
times were
had
tense.
plans in place.
Both sides, both sides
yes.
had plans in place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. Beautiful state. And I recommend everybody, if you haven't been in Alaska, you owe it to yourself to go and see this majestic uh, landmass, or that gorgeous nature that you see there. So if you have anything else to add, if not, we can say goodbye to our viewers until the next topic and next fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Kurosh. Only thing to add is definitely visit Sitka. If you want a little bit of the Russian-American history, it's very well preserved
Yes,
and very well
please.
done. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It was
you.
wonderful. And thank you all for watching. Thank you.
Thank you.